William Shakespeare, Shakespeare also spelled Shakspere, by name Bard of Avon or Swan of Avon, baptized April 26, 1564, Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, England, died April 23, 1616, Stratford-upon-Avon, English poet, dramatist, and actor, often called the English national poet and considered by many to be the greatest dramatist of all time. Shakespeare occupies a position unique in world literature. Other poets, such as Homer and Dante, and novelists, such as Leo Tolstoy and Charles Dickens, have transcended national barriers, but no writer's living reputation can compare to that of Shakespeare, whose plays, written in the late 16th and early 17th centuries for a small repertory theater, are now performed and read more often and in more countries than ever before. The prophecy of his great contemporary, the poet and dramatist Ben Jonson, that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time, has been fulfilled. It may be audacious even to attempt a definition of his greatness, but it is not so difficult to describe the gifts that enabled him to create imaginative visions of pathos and mirth that, whether read or witnessed in the theater, fill the mind and linger there. He is a writer of great intellectual rapidity, perceptiveness, and poetic power. Other writers have had these qualities, but with Shakespeare the keenness of mind was applied not to abstruse or remote subjects but to human beings and their complete range of emotions and conflicts. Other writers have applied their keenness of mind in this way, but Shakespeare is astonishingly clever with words and images, so that his mental energy, when applied to intelligible human situations, finds full and memorable expression, convincing and imaginatively stimulating. As if this were not enough, the art form into which his creative energies went was not remote and bookish but involved the vivid stage impersonation of human beings, commanding sympathy and inviting vicarious participation. Thus, Shakespeare's merits can survive translation into other languages and into cultures remote from that of Elizabethan England. Life. Although the amount of factual knowledge available about Shakespeare is surprisingly large for one of his station in life, many find it a little disappointing, for it is mostly gleaned from documents of an official character. Dates of baptisms, marriages, deaths, and burials, wills, conveyances, legal processes, and payments by the court, these are the dusty details. There are, however, many contemporary allusions to him as a writer, and these add a reasonable amount of flesh and blood to the biographical skeleton. Early life in Stratford. The parish register of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, shows that he was baptized there on April 26, 1564. His birthday is traditionally celebrated on April 23. His father, John Shakespeare, was a burgess of the borough, who in 1565 was chosen an alderman and in 1568 bailiff, the position corresponding to mayor, before the grant of a further charter to Stratford in 1664. He was engaged in various kinds of trade and appears to have suffered some fluctuations in prosperity. His wife, Mary Arden, of Wilmcote, Warwickshire, came from an ancient family and was the heiress to some land. Given the somewhat rigid social distinctions of the 16th century, this marriage must have been a step up the social scale for John Shakespeare. Stratford enjoyed a grammar school of good quality, and the education there was free, the schoolmaster's salary being paid by the borough. No lists of the pupils who were at the school in the 16th century have survived, but it would be absurd to suppose the bailiff of the town did not send his son there. The boy's education would consist mostly of Latin studies, learning to read, write, and speak the language fairly well and studying some of the classical historians, moralists, and poets. Shakespeare did not go on to the university, and indeed it is unlikely that the scholarly round of logic, rhetoric, and other studies then followed there would have interested him. Career in the theatre of William Shakespeare. The first reference to Shakespeare in the literary world of London comes in 1592, when a fellow dramatist, Robert Greene, declared in a pamphlet written on his deathbed. What these words mean is difficult to determine, but clearly they are insulting, and clearly Shakespeare is the object of the sarcasms. When the book in which they appear, Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit, bought with £1,000,000 of repentance, 1592, was published after Greene's death, a mutual acquaintance wrote a preface offering an apology to Shakespeare and testifying to his worth. This preface also indicates that Shakespeare was by then making important friends. For, although the puritanical city of London was generally hostile to the theatre, Many of the nobility were good patrons of the drama and friends of the actors. Shakespeare seems to have attracted the attention of the young Henry Wriothesley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, and to this nobleman were dedicated his first published poems, Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. One striking piece of evidence that Shakespeare began to prosper early and tried to retrieve the family's fortunes and establish its gentility is the fact that a coat of arms was granted to John Shakespeare in 1596. Rough drafts of this grant have been preserved in the College of Arms, London, though the final document, which must have been handed to the Shakespeares, has not survived. Almost certainly William himself took the initiative and paid the fees. The coat of arms appears on Shakespeare's monument, constructed before 1623, in the Stratford Church. Equally interesting as evidence of Shakespeare's worldly success was his purchase in 1597 of New Place, a large house in Stratford, which he as a boy must have passed every day in walking to school. How his career in the theatre began is unclear, but from roughly 1594 onward he was an important member of the Lord Chamberlain's company of players, called the King's Men after the accession of James I in 1603. They had the best actor, Richard Burbage. They had the best theatre, the Globe, finished by the autumn of 1599. They had the best dramatist, Shakespeare. It is no wonder that the company prospered. Shakespeare became a full-time professional man of his own theatre, sharing in a cooperative enterprise and intimately concerned with the financial success of the plays he wrote. Unfortunately, written records give little indication of the way in which Shakespeare's professional life molded his marvelous artistry. All that can be deduced is that for 20 years Shakespeare devoted himself assiduously to his art, writing more than 1 million words of poetic drama of the highest quality. Private life. Shakespeare had little contact with officialdom, apart from walking, dressed in the royal livery as a member of the King's Men, at the coronation of King James I in 1604. He continued to look after his financial interests. He bought properties in London and in Stratford. In 1605 he purchased a share, about 1/5, of the Stratford tithes, a fact that explains why he was eventually buried in the chancel of its parish church. For some time he lodged with a French Huguenot family called Mountjoy, who lived near St. Olave's Church in Cripplegate, London. The records of a lawsuit in May 1612, resulting from a Mountjoy family quarrel, show Shakespeare as giving evidence in a genial way, though unable to remember certain important facts that would have decided the case, and as interesting himself generally in the family's affairs. No letters written by Shakespeare have survived, but a private letter to him happened to get caught up with some official transactions of the town of Stratford and so has been preserved in the borough archives. It was written by one Richard Quinney and addressed by him from the Bell Inn in Carter Lane, London, whither he had gone from Stratford on business. On one side of the paper is inscribed, "To my loving good friend and countryman, Mr. W.M. Shakespeare, deliver these." Apparently Quinney thought his fellow Stratfordian a person to whom he could apply for the loan of £30, a large sum in Elizabethan times. Nothing further is known about the transaction, but, because so few opportunities of seeing into Shakespeare's private life present themselves, this begging letter becomes a touching document. It is of some interest, moreover, that 18 years later Quinney's son Thomas became the husband of Judith, Shakespeare's second daughter. Shakespeare's will, made on March 25, 1616, as a long and detailed document. It entailed his quite ample property on the male heirs of his elder daughter, Susanna. Both his daughters were then married, one to the aforementioned Thomas Quinney and the other to John Hull, a respected physician of Stratford. As an afterthought, he bequeathed his second-best bed to his wife. No one can be certain what this notorious legacy means. The testator's signatures to the will are apparently in a shaky hand. Perhaps Shakespeare was already ill. He died on April 23, 1616. No name was inscribed on his gravestone in the chancel of the parish church of Stratford-upon-Avon. Instead these lines, possibly his own, appeared. Sexuality of William Shakespeare. Like so many circumstances of Shakespeare's personal life, the question of his sexual nature is shrouded in uncertainty. At age 18, in 1582, he married Anne Hathaway, a woman who was 8 years older than he. Their first child, Susanna, was born on May 26, 1583, about 6 months after the marriage ceremony. A license had been issued for the marriage on November 27, 1582, with only one reading, instead of the usual 3, of the banns, or announcement of the intent to marry in order to give any party the opportunity to raise any potential legal objections. This procedure and the swift arrival of the couple's first child suggest that the pregnancy was unplanned, as it was certainly premarital. The marriage thus appears to have been a shotgun wedding. Anne gave birth some 21 months after the arrival of Susanna to twins, named Hamnet and Judith, who were christened on February 2, 1585. Thereafter William and Anne had no more children. They remained married until his death in 1616. Were they compatible, or did William prefer to live apart from Anne for most of this time? When he moved to London at some point between 1585 and 1592, he did not take his family with him. Divorce was nearly impossible in this era. Were there medical or other reasons for the absence of any more children? Was he present in Stratford when Hamnet, his only son, died in 1596 at age 11? He bought a fine house for his family in Stratford and acquired real estate in the vicinity. He was eventually buried in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, where Anne joined him in 1623. He seems to have retired to Stratford from London about 1612. He had lived apart from his wife and children, except presumably for occasional visits in the course of a very busy professional life, for at least 2 decades. His bequeathing in his last will and testament of his second-best bed to Anne, with no further mention of her name in that document, has suggested to many scholars that the marriage was a disappointment necessitated by an unplanned pregnancy. What was Shakespeare's love life like during those decades in London, apart from his family? Knowledge on this subject is uncertain at best. According to an entry dated March 13, 1602, in the commonplace book of a law student named John Manningham, Shakespeare had a brief affair after he happened to overhear a female citizen at a performance of Richard III making an assignation with Richard Burbage, the leading actor of the acting company to which Shakespeare also belonged. Taking advantage of having overheard their conversation, Shakespeare allegedly hastened to the place where the assignation had been arranged, was entertained by the woman, and was at his game when Burbage showed up. When a message was brought that Richard III had arrived, Shakespeare is supposed to have caused return to be made that William the Conqueror was before Richard III. Shakespeare's name William. This diary entry of Manningham's must be regarded with much skepticism, since it is verified by no other evidence and since it may simply speak to the timeless truth that actors are regarded as free spirits and bohemians. Indeed, the story was so amusing that it was retold, embellished, and printed in Thomas Likes' A General View of the Stage, 1759, well before Manningham's diary was discovered. It does at least suggest, at any rate, that Manningham imagined it to be true that Shakespeare was heterosexual and not averse to an occasional infidelity to his marriage vows. The film Shakespeare in Love, 1998, plays amusedly with this idea in its purely fictional presentation of Shakespeare's torchy affair with a young woman named Viola de Lesseps, who was eager to become a player in a professional acting company and who inspired Shakespeare in his writing of Romeo and Juliet, indeed, giving him some of his best lines. Apart from these intriguing circumstances, little evidence survives other than the poems and plays that Shakespeare wrote. Can anything be learned from them? The sonnets, written perhaps over an extended period from the early 1590s into the 1600s, chronicle a deeply loving relationship between the speaker of the sonnets and a well-born young man. At times the poet-speaker is greatly sustained and comforted by a love that seems reciprocal. More often, the relationship is one that is troubled by painful absences, by jealousies, by the poet's perception that other writers are winning the young man's affection, and finally by the deep unhappiness of an outright desertion in which the young man takes away from the poet-speaker the dark-haired beauty whose sexual favors the poet-speaker has enjoyed, though not without some revulsion at his own unbridled lust, as in Sonnet 129. This narrative would seem to posit heterosexual desire in the poet-speaker, even if of a troubled and guilty sort, but to the earlier sonnets suggest also a desire for the young man? The relationship is portrayed as indeed deeply emotional and dependent. The poet-speaker cannot live without his friend and that friend's returning the love that the poet-speaker so ardently feels. Yet readers today cannot easily tell whether that love is aimed at physical completion. Indeed, Sonnet 20 seems to deny that possibility by insisting that nature's having equipped the friend with one thing to my purpose nothing, that is, a penis, means that physical sex must be regarded as solely in the province of the friend's relationship with women. But since she, nature, pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love and thy love's use their treasure. The body pun on pricked underscores the sexual meaning of the sonnet's concluding couplet. Critic Joseph Picquigney has argued at length that the sonnets nonetheless do commemorate a consummated physical relationship between the poet-speaker and the friend, but most commentators have backed away from such a bold assertion. A significant difficulty is that one cannot be sure that the sonnets are autobiographical. Shakespeare is such a masterful dramatist that one can easily imagine him creating such an intriguing storyline as the basis for his sonnet sequence. Then, too, are the sonnets printed in the order that Shakespeare would have intended? He seems not to have been involved in their publication in 1609, long after most of them had been written. Even so, one can perhaps ask why such a story would have appealed to Shakespeare. Is there a level at which fantasy and dreamwork may be involved? The plays and other poems lend themselves uncertainly to such speculation. Loving relationships between two men are sometimes portrayed as extraordinarily deep. Antonio in Twelfth Night protests to Sebastian that he needs to accompany Sebastian on his adventures even at great personal risk. If you will not murder me for my love, let me be your servant, Act 2, Scene 1, lines 33 to 34. That is to say, I will die if you leave me behind. Another Antonio, in The Merchant of Venice, risks his life for his loving friend Bassanio. Actors in today's theater regularly portray these relationships as homosexual, and indeed actors are often incredulous toward anyone who doubts that to be the case. In Troilus and Cressida, Patroclus is rumored to be Achilles' masculine whore, v. 1, line 17, as is suggested in Homer, and certainly the two are very close in friendship, though Patroclus does admonish Achilles to engage in battle by saying. Again, on the modern stage this relationship is often portrayed as obviously, even flagrantly, sexual. But whether Shakespeare saw it as such, or the play valorizes homosexuality or bisexuality, is another matter. Certainly his plays contain many warmly positive depictions of heterosexuality, in the loves of Romeo and Juliet, Orlando and Rosalind, and Henry V and Catherine of France, among many others. At the same time, Shakespeare is astute in his representations of sexual ambiguity. Viola, in disguise as a young man, Cesario, in Twelfth Night, wins the love of Duke Orsino in such a delicate way that what appears to be the love between two men morphs into the heterosexual mating of Orsino and Viola. The ambiguity is reinforced by the audience's knowledge that in Shakespeare's theater Viola, Cesario was portrayed by a boy actor of perhaps 16. All the cross-dressing situations in the comedies, involving Portia in The Merchant of Venice, Rosalind, Ganymede in As You Like It, Imogen in Cymbeline, and many others, playfully explore the uncertain boundaries between the genders. Rosalind's male disguise name in As You Like It, Ganymede, is that of the cupbearer to Zeus with whom the god was enamored. The ancient legends assume that Ganymede was Zeus's catamite. Shakespeare is characteristically delicate on that score, but he does seem to delight in the frisson of sexual suggestion, early posthumous documentation of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's family or friends, however, were not content with a simple gravestone, and, within a few years, a monument was erected on the chancel wall. It seems to have existed by 1623. Its epitaph, written in Latin and inscribed immediately below the bust, attributes to Shakespeare the worldly wisdom of Nestor, the genius of Socrates, and the poetic art of Virgil. This apparently was how his contemporaries in Stratford-upon-Avon wished their fellow citizen to be remembered. The tributes of his colleagues. The memory of Shakespeare survived long in theatrical circles, for his plays remained a major part of the repertory of the King's Men until the closing of the theaters in 1642. The greatest of Shakespeare's great contemporaries in the theater, Ben Jonson, had a good deal to say about him. To William Drummond of Hawthornden in 1619 he said that Shakespeare wanted art. But, when Jonson came to write his splendid poem prefixed to the folio edition of Shakespeare's plays in 1623, he rose to the occasion with stirring words of praise. Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show. to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all time. Besides almost retracting his earlier jibe about Shakespeare's lack of art, he gives testimony that Shakespeare's personality was to be felt, by those who knew him, in his poetry, that the style was the man. Jonson also reminded his readers of the strong impression the plays had made upon Queen Elizabeth I and King James I at court performances. Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were, to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames, that so did take Eliza and our James. Shakespeare seems to have been on affectionate terms with his theatre colleagues. His fellow actors John Hemming and Henry Condell, who, with Burbage, were remembered in his will, dedicated the first folio of 1623 to the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Montgomery, explaining that they had collected the plays, without ambition either of self-profit or fame, only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend and fellow alive as was our Shakespeare. Anecdotes and documents. 17th-century antiquaries began to collect anecdotes about Shakespeare, but no serious life was written until 1709, when Nicholas Rowe tried to assemble information from all available sources with the aim of producing a connected narrative. There were local traditions at Stratford, witticisms and lampoons of local characters, scandalous stories of drunkenness and sexual escapades. About 1661, the vicar of Stratford wrote in his diary, "Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and it seems drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted." On the other hand, the antiquary John Aubrey wrote in some notes about Shakespeare, "He was not a company keeper, lived in Shoreditch, wouldn't be debauched, and, if invited to, writ he was in pain." Richard Davies, Archdeacon of Lichfield, reported, "He died a papist." How much trust can be put in such a story is uncertain. In the early 18th century a story appeared that Queen Elizabeth had obliged Shakespeare to write a play of Sir John Falstaff in love, and that he had performed the task, The Merry Wives of Windsor, in a fortnight. There are other stories, all of uncertain authenticity and some mere fabrications. When serious scholarship began in the 18th century, it was too late to gain anything from traditions. But documents began to be discovered. Shakespeare's will was found in 1747 and his marriage license in 1836. The documents relating to the Mountjoy lawsuit already mentioned were found and printed in 1910. It is conceivable that further documents of a legal nature may yet be discovered, but as time passes the hope becomes more remote. Modern scholarship is more concerned to study Shakespeare in relation to his social environment, both in Stratford and in London. This is not easy, because the author and actor lived a somewhat detached life. A respected tithe-owning country gentleman in Stratford, perhaps, but a rather rootless artist in London.